All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating perspective on how the United States acquired the American Southwest. We'll be walking through this explainer of Chapter 8 from Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Now, if you know Zinn, you know he looks at history a little differently. Instead of focusing on the politicians or the generals, he zeroes in on everyday people. We're talking the working class, the folks who actively dissented, and the common soldiers on the ground. And his analysis of the Mexican-American War, which went down between 1846 and 1848, is a perfect showcase of that approach.
I want you to think about the massive irony Zinn highlights right off the bat here. How exactly does a nation double its size, literally taking half of Mexico's landmass, while turning around and claiming it took absolutely nothing by conquest? It's wild, right? This 1848 quote from the Whig intelligencer perfectly captures the official story at the time, a narrative of peaceful, almost inevitable expansion. But as we'll see through Zinn's research, the reality in the mud and in the halls of Congress was a completely different story.
To really get a handle on Zinn's perspective, we're going to hit 5 key themes today: the drive for expansion, provoking the conflict, voices of dissent, the soldier's reality, and finally, the irony of conquest.
So, starting off with part 1, the drive for expansion, focusing on manifest destiny and elite interests.
According to Zinn, this war wasn't just some spontaneous clash out of nowhere. It was the result of a long-standing ambition among the elites for land, wealth, and commercial dominance. We can trace this rapid escalation chronologically. Mexico wins its independence from Spain in 1821, and at that point they hold a massive territory including what we now know as California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. With some help from the U.S., Texas breaks away in 1836, and by 1845 the U.S. formally brings Texas into the Union. Literally the very next year, war is declared. So as you can see, this expansion was a deliberate, step-by-step process.
And this is where the famous manifest destiny rhetoric comes into play. Politicians use this idea to justify aggressive expansion. It wasn't framed as a land grab, they spun it as a racial and divine imperative. Representative Giles states openly what was being echoed in newspapers and rallies all over the country. They truly believed they were destined to rule the continent, which, conveniently enough, provided the perfect moral cover for a war of acquisition.
Which brings us to Section 2, provoking the conflict, or how to orchestrate a war.
This part is fascinating. Zinn points out that President James K. Polk didn't just sit around waiting for a fight. He actively manufactured one. He sent American troops deep into disputed territory that had historically been controlled by Mexicans. When a skirmish inevitably broke out, Polk rushed to Congress full of indignation, claiming that American blood was shed on American soil. But a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln wasn't buying it. He introduced his famous spot resolutions, repeatedly challenging the president to point to the exact spot where this supposedly happened, because Lincoln knew the troops were in disputed, if not outright Mexican territory. And the speed of all this is just crazy. By severely limiting debate time in Congress, the administration completely bypassed any close scrutiny. Think about that for a second. A literal declaration of war, and they limited the debate to just 2 hours. Barely half an hour was actually spent discussing the real issues. Zinn emphasizes this detail to show how the political machinery just rammed the war through before anyone could organize a proper opposition. Okay, moving right along to part 3, voices of dissent and the anti-war movement.
Usually, we're taught that everyone was totally united behind this war, right? But Zinn counters that traditional narrative by showing a deeply divided nation. He presents evidence of widespread pushback from a really diverse coalition. The Anti-Slavery Society explicitly called it a war to expand slavery. The New England Working Men's Association completely condemned it, refusing to take up arms to help slaveholders rob others of their labor. You even had mass meetings of Irish workers in New York and Boston protesting the conflict. This definitely wasn't some fringe movement. It was a huge slice of the American public.
Frederick Douglass, the prominent abolitionist and former slave, was incredibly vocal about this in his newspaper, The North Star. He saw completely through the patriotic framing. He called the war an exercise in greed, or cupidity, and a sheer love of dominion. He didn't hold back on politicians either, fiercely criticizing those who claimed to oppose the war but still voted to fund it anyway. For Douglass, true peace meant having the courage to stand up to the administration, no matter the risks.
We also see these incredible moments of individual civil disobedience.
Henry David Thoreau was so disgusted by the war that he outright refused to pay his Massachusetts poll tax to fund it. He literally spent a night in jail over it. And while his friends eventually bailed him out by paying the tax for him, that single night behind bars inspired his famous essay, Civil Disobedience. It really goes to show that anti-war sentiment reached deep into the heart of American intellectual culture.
Let's dive into Section 4, The Soldier's Reality, examining glory versus atrocity. Zinn's whole approach is to look at history from the ground up. So while elites were safely debating strategy in Washington, what was life actually like for the folks carrying the rifles? The recruitment posters promised all this glory, adventure, and federal bounties of land and money, but the reality of marching through Mexico was dominated by awful stuff: disease, dysentery, extreme heat, and just horrifying violence.
Here's a stat that might surprise you. Half, 50% of General Taylor's army were recent immigrants, largely Irish and German, and they were lured in much more by the promise of a paycheck and opportunity than by any deep-burning patriotism for manifest destiny. They were mostly poor, working-class men just trying to survive. Zinn notes that their patriotism wasn't exactly sky-high to begin with, so as the brutal realities of the war set in, their morale absolutely tanked.
Because the conditions were terrible, and the discipline was completely tyrannical. Officers were notorious for brutalizing their own men. Disillusionment set in fast. You had hundreds of soldiers deserting. Some were driven by conscience, others just pure survival. In fact, many actually joined the Mexican army, fighting against their former comrades in what became known as the San Patricio, or St. Patrick's Battalion.
This quote from an anonymous volunteer really cuts through the noise. Writing to the Cambridge Chronicle, he pushed back hard against the romanticized propaganda. He basically said he'd rather go to the poorhouse than deal with the mosquitoes, the bad rations, the cruel officers, and the human butchery. It is such a stark, honest voice from the working class that just shatters the illusion of those official recruitment promises. Which leads us to our final section, Part 5, The Irony of Conquest, looking at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So after Mexico City falls to a horrific bombardment that killed countless civilians, Mexico is ultimately forced to surrender. By February 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, and the border moves all the way down to the Rio Grande. California, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, literally half of Mexico's entire country was transferred to the United States. It was one of the largest territorial grabs in modern history, and it fundamentally changed the map of North America forever.
And in exchange for this incredibly vast, resource-rich territory, the United States paid Mexico a measly $15 million. Zinn points this out to show how the U.S. government tried to slap a transactional veneer over the whole thing, kind of attempting to legitimize what was, at its core, a massive military seizure. They bombed the capital, destroyed the army, took the land, and then handed over a check.
So we end up right back where we started, looking at the glaring irony of that opening quote. We take nothing by conquest, thank God. Zinn deliberately contrasts this incredibly sanitized official story of innocent acquisition against a historical record that's actually filled with the blood of soldiers, displaced populations, and deeply dissenting citizens.
To wrap up this explainer, Zinn's analysis leaves us with a pretty heavy question. Whose voices are we prioritizing when we look back at the past? If we only listen to the presidents and the newspaper editors, sure, we hear a nice story of divine destiny and peaceful expansion. But when we actually read the letters of dissenting soldiers, the protests of working men, and the speeches of abolitionists, we get a much more complex, and frankly, a much more honest picture of how our borders were actually drawn. I hope this gave you a solid, engaging look into a pivotal moment in history. Keep asking the tough questions, keep looking critically at the sources, and I'll see you in the next one.